All right, so are you curious about the love hypothesis? But not sure if it's worth all the hype. Well, we are diving into that today. We've got reviews, discussions, the whole shebang to help you figure out if this book deserves a spot on your reading list.
And I'm jumping in as your romance novel guide. Let's cut to the chase. This one's a bit divisive. You've got people head over heels for it or rolling their eyes at the tropes. Our mission, figuring out which side you'll land on.
Perfect. Now, I know it's super popular, but a lot of times hyped up books can be a letdown. What's the deal with the love hypothesis?
Well, it's Ollie Hazelwood's debut novel, which is important context. Think of it as beach read energy. Not a deep dive into complex characters. It's got that STEM setting that's trendy right now, with a PhD student, Olive, trying to make a pancreatic cancer research breakthrough.
Okay, science and romance, I'm intrigued.
Hmm.
But does the writing actually hold up?
That's where things get interesting. Hazelwood's style is definitely easy to read, which is a plus for a lot of people. But some reviewers who loved her later books found this one a bit rough around the edges, especially in the dialogue. Imagine it like your favorite band's first album. Catchy tunes, but maybe not their most polished work.
Gotcha. So maybe not award-winning prose, but still enjoyable. What about the romance itself? It's built on the classic fake dating trope, which, as you know, can be hit or miss.
Olive gets caught up in the scheme with Adam Carlson, the professor who's kind of got this intimidating reputation.
Okay, I'm already seeing potential for some fun tension there. But I've been burned by fake dating plots before. Do they actually make it believable?
That depends on what you find believable. Some reviewers love their banter and chemistry, even if the whole setup was a bit contrived, but others felt it was too reliant on miscommunication, which honestly is a common romance novel pitfall.
Ugh, yes. Nothing's more frustrating than characters who just need to talk to each other. Does that make up the bulk of the drama?
It's definitely a driving force. But there are other elements at play, too. One that sparked a lot of debate was the demisexuality representation. Olive seems to be coded that way, but opinions vary on how well it was handled.
That's important to get right. Could you maybe unpack that a bit more for listeners who might not be familiar with the term?
Absolutely. Demisexuality essentially means someone only develops sexual attraction after forming a strong emotional bond. Now, some reviewers felt seen by Olive's portrayal, while others argued it leaned into harmful stereotypes about demisexual people being fixed by the right partner.
So definitely something to be aware of going in. It sounds like there are layers to this book beyond just the surface level romance. What about the STEM side of things? Does it feel authentic?
Reviewers who work in STEM fields had mixed reactions. Some loved seeing their world represented, especially the struggles of being a grad student. Others felt the science was a bit oversimplified, or even inaccurate at times. It's not the Martian level of detail, let's put it that way.
Right, I get that. It can be tough to balance accuracy with keeping things accessible for a wider audience. So how does it stack up against other popular romance novels? Especially if someone's already a fan of, say, Christina Lauren or something.
Good question. Some compared Hazelwood's style to Christina Lauren, especially the humor. But even those making the comparison often said Christina Lauren's books have more depth and emotional complexity. The love hypothesis leans more towards light and fluffy.
Okay, so maybe not the most groundbreaking romance,
Yeah,
but potentially a fun distraction.
exactly. And it's worth noting that a lot of the harshest criticisms came from people who loved Hazelwood's later books.
Huh.
This one has a lot of the elements that made her popular, but they felt she hadn't quite honed her craft yet.
So it's like a stepping stone to her better work. That's actually helpful to know, because if I'm going to invest my time, I'd rather go for her more polished stuff.
That's a valid point. If you're looking for her A game, this might not be the place to start. But there are some specific things the love hypothesis does well that might appeal to certain readers.
Like what? I'm all ears. Give me those selling points.
One thing that consistently gets praise is the humor. Think snappy dialogue, witty observations. Those moments that make you actually laugh out loud while reading.
Okay, I can always appreciate that. What kind of humor are we talking? Self-deprecating? Situational? Give me an example.
Well, a lot of it comes from the clash between Olive's more anxious personality and Adam's dry, sarcastic wit. There's this one scene where she's trying to explain the fake dating situation to her friends, and it just spirals into this hilariously awkward mess. Readers really seem to connect with that kind of relatable, cringeworthy humor.
I can see that working. I like a romance that doesn't take itself too seriously. But you mentioned earlier that some reviewers found the whole fake dating premise a bit manipulative. How does that play out in the actual story?
It's definitely a valid concern. The whole thing starts with Olive impulsively kissing Adam. To convince her friend she's moved on from her ex. Not exactly the most ethical foundation for a relationship, right?
Yeah, that's a bit of a red flag for me. I'm not a fan of unnecessary drama or characters making decisions that seem out of character just to move the plot forward.
And that's where the whole manage your expectations thing comes in. If you're okay with suspending disbelief and accepting that this is a rom-com world where people sometimes make questionable choices for the sake of love, then you can probably roll with it. But if you're looking for a more grounded, realistic portrayal of relationships, this might not be your jam.
Right, I get that. Sometimes you just want pure escapism, and sometimes you want something that feels a bit more true to life. So, aside from the humor and the morally ambiguous beginnings, what else stood out in the reviews?
The food descriptions got a surprising amount of love. Apparently, Hazelwood really knows how to make a meal sound mouth-watering.
Oh, interesting. I'm a sucker for good food writing. Does it play a big role in the story, or is it just a side detail?
It's more like sprinkled throughout. Olive and Adam have a few dates where the food is almost a character itself. They bond over a shared love of spicy food. There's this whole scene with a delicious-sounding pastry. It's definitely enough to make you want to grab a snack while reading.
Okay, that's a win in my book. And you mentioned earlier that some people felt the STEM setting was oversimplified. Can you elaborate on that? What were their specific criticisms?
Some reviewers with actual science backgrounds felt like the research details were a bit vague and hand-wavy. It's like the science is there to provide a backdrop and a reason for Olive and Adam to interact, but it's not explored in a super in-depth way.
So it's more about the romance than the science, which I guess makes sense for a rom-com.
Right. It's not trying to be a science textbook,
Yeah.
but it's also not quite hitting the mark for readers who are really looking for that authentic STEM representation.
I think you've done a great job of painting a picture of the book's strengths and weaknesses. But for someone who's still on the fence, what would you say is the deciding factor in whether or not to read The Love Hypothesis?
I think it comes down to this. Are you looking for a light, funny, escapist read that doesn't require too much brain power? If so, this could be a good fit. But if you're craving something more complex, nuanced, and emotionally resonant, you might want to look elsewhere.
Fair enough. And I guess that leads us to the big question. Would you recommend it?
It depends. If you're a die-hard romance fan who's devoured everything else out there and just needs something new, go for it. But if you're more selective with your reading time, there are probably other books that would be a better use of your energy.
Solid advice. So it sounds like The Love Hypothesis is a bit of a guilty pleasure read then. Something you enjoy despite its flaws.
Exactly. It's like that movie you know is cheesy and predictable, but still makes you laugh every time you watch it. You're not going to win any awards for good taste, but sometimes that's okay. Reading should be fun too.
Totally agree. And speaking of fun reads, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about some other books that might scratch a similar itch. You mentioned Christina Lauren earlier. What are some of her books that you'd recommend, especially for someone who's curious about the love hypothesis, but maybe wants something a little more substantial?
Great question. If you like the fake dating trope but want more depth, Christina Lauren's The Unhoneymooners is a good option. It's got a similar enemies to lovers vibe, but the characters are a bit more fleshed out, and the plot has a few more twists and turns.
Ooh, I've heard good things about that one. What about something with a STEM setting? Are there any other books out there that nail that particular niche?
Absolutely. The Soulmate Equation by Christina Lauren is a great choice. It's about a data scientist who develops an algorithm to predict romantic compatibility. And it gets into some really interesting ethical and philosophical questions about love and relationships.
That sounds fascinating. I'm adding that to my list right now. Anything else that comes to mind? Maybe something with a similar level of humor to The Love Hypothesis.
For pure laugh-out-loud moments, you can't go wrong with anything by Talia Hibbert. Her Brown Sisters series is a perfect blend of romance, humor, and family dynamics. They're contemporary romances, so no STEM setting. But the writing is witty, the characters are relatable, and the relationships feel authentic.
Okay, those are some excellent recommendations. I'm sensing a theme here.
Okay.
Christina Lauren seems to be the go-to for smart, funny romances.
She's definitely a master of the genre, but there are tons of other great authors out there too. It really depends on what you're looking for in a romance novel.
That's true. It's all about finding the right book for the right mood. And sometimes that mood calls for a light, fluffy escapist read like The Love Hypothesis.
Exactly. There's a time and a place for every kind of book. And sometimes you just need a dose of cheesy goodness to brighten your day.
Well said. So for our listener, We've explored the love hypothesis from all angles, compared it to other popular books, and hopefully given you enough information to decide if it's the right fit for your reading list. But before we wrap things up, I have one final question for you. Knowing this is Ollie Hazelwood's first book, is there anything here that hints at the author she'd become? Like, if I enjoy certain elements, should I check out her later works?
That's a really astute observation. And yes, absolutely. The seeds of her signature style are definitely present here. For instance, the fast-paced plot and banter-heavy dialogue become even more polished in her later books.
So even if the writing isn't perfect here, those who enjoy her voice will likely see the potential.
Exactly. And it's interesting you bring up voice, because that's another thing that carries through. If you connect with Olive's inner monologue, a bit anxious, a bit self-deprecating, but ultimately determined, you'll find similar heroines in her other works.
That's helpful. So for our listener,
Yeah.
if they're enjoying those aspects, it's almost like a sneak peek at what Hazelwood does best, even if it's not fully formed yet.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's like seeing an artist's early sketches. You might see some flaws, but you also see the raw talent and hints of the masterpieces to come.
I love that analogy. So big picture, knowing what we know now, what's your final verdict on the love hypothesis? Should our listener add it to their TBR pile?
If they're looking for a light fun and quick read with a STEM twist, and they enjoy that will they won't they attention of fake dating, then absolutely. Especially if they're intrigued by the idea of a demisexual heroine, even if the representation isn't universally praised.
But for those who are seeking something deeper, more emotionally complex, or more demanding of their time, maybe not so much.
Right. There are definitely other romance novels out there that might be a better fit for those readers. We've mentioned a few great alternatives, from authors like Christina Lauren and Talia Hibbert.
So final takeaway for our listener. Consider your mood, your priorities, and what you want to get out of a reading experience. The love hypothesis might not be for everyone, but it definitely has its place in the vast and wonderful world of romance fiction.
And hey, sometimes you just need a book that makes you smile and lets you escape into a world of witty banter and scientific shenanigans. If that sounds like your cup of tea, then dive right in.
Perfectly said. Now, for anyone listening who's already devoured the love hypothesis and is craving more, what would you suggest as their next step?
If they loved Hazelwood's style, I definitely recommend checking out her later works. The love hypothesis was just the beginning, and she's only gotten better with each book. You can really see her growth as an author.
So it's worth exploring her bibliography further to see how her writing has evolved.
Absolutely. And if they're interested in diving deeper into specific aspects of the book, like the demisexuality representation or the STEM setting, there are tons of great resources and discussions online.
Awesome. And for those who are new to Ollie Hazelwood, maybe start with the love hypothesis and see how it feels. It might just be the gateway to a whole new world of romance reading.
Exactly. It's like a taste test. If you like what you sample, there's a whole buffet waiting for you.
Perfect analogy. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you've enjoyed our exploration of the love hypothesis, and hopefully you now have a better sense of whether or not it's the right book for you.
And remember, the most important thing is to find books that bring you joy and make you want to keep turning the pages.
Couldn't agree more. And until next time, happy reading.